Okay, in this video, I'm going to go over the literature review, and I'm also going to speak to the annotated bibliography. All right, so let's go through each of these items. So the literature review is a special document that we use, and I'm going to talk about this in terms of a thesis or a dissertation, but it can also be a literature review as a manuscript. So I'm going to talk about each of these. The literature review is written in prose. It's written in paragraph format. It's written with an introduction, method section, and presenting some results and then some discussion. So it reads like a manuscript. An annotated bibliography is a little different. It's a much more succinct compilation of information. And a lot of times you start with an annotated bibliography and then you use that to develop your literature review. For some of you who are working in a class like KM 499 independent study, you may be putting together an annotated bibliography. And just know that that's different than doing a deeper dive on each paper. For those of you who are working on your master's thesis document or dissertation, you have a chapter that is dedicated to the literature review. I'm going to speak to that in a little bit more detail. An annotated bibliography is, as I've noted here, a short paragraph about each source. You provide some key information. And what you're doing is you're trying to provide enough notes that you may want to go back and do a deeper dive on that paper after collecting lots of information. So it's sort of a shortcut to make sure that the paper may be relevant that you're going to want to include in some written document. And some key information that you want to include are things like the purpose statement, sometimes a brief description of the methods, and again, very succinct here. But sometimes it's subjects, the number of subjects or expertise of the subject on a particular task or instruments, procedures. The detail that you go in here is sort of depending on the type of information that you're trying to compile. So it's not always going to be the same for every annotated bibliography. You also want to include some key results, not all the results, but again, you're going to probably want to zero in on something. So a lot of times a paper may have multiple dependent variables, but you may be interested in maybe two dependent variables from that paper, and that's what you would include in your annotation of the reference. And then something about the conclusion or something that the authors are saying, here's a take-home message from this paper. In either of these cases, do not rely on the abstract. In fact, when you ultimately present a reference for anything that you want me to review, you will have had to have read the entire paper. You cannot rely on the abstract only. If you can't get the entire paper, you cannot include it in your bibliography or in your literature review. And the reason for that is that the abstract is the author's version of a succinct presentation of the key information, but you may actually want different information, or you may want to understand the context that information is being presented under. All right. So, and I do coach students, however, in the beginning of putting together a bibliography, is that is a time that you can list references that you will not have read the entire paper of. You may be looking for papers that have keywords in a title, or maybe keywords in an abstract, and that might be enough to include it in a bibliography. But once you go to an annotated bibliography or a literature review, that's where I want you to have the full paper and will have read the full paper. A bibliography by itself is just a list of references, more so than an annotated bibliography or literature review, where you are doing a bit of a deeper dive on the information that's being presented. So here's an example of an annotated bibliography. Someone just used Excel and created different columns where they listed the author, the year. Generally, I would include a link to the paper here as well. You can include the DOI or maybe a link to the full reference or minimally include the APA style reference so that you can always find this reference later on. Sometimes you may even want to include a column that you have a PDF of the paper, and you save the PDF in a file structure that you can go and refer to later. But here, this student has a problem statement, so purpose statement listed here, participant description. They have some measures that they were interested in from these studies. And you can see how some studies did not apply. So this probably is a secondary source here. So it doesn't have some information. That's okay. That's part of doing an annotated bibliography, is you sort of tease that out. And here they also have information on procedures and the experimental design, maybe the intervention, sort of a shortcut to what the study was really trying to manipulate, and then some key results, and then finally a conclusion. You can see I cut it off here. So there's actually some other columns here, but it's annotated. It's a little bit more detail. And now you have a list of references, and this is just listing 3 here. There's a lot more for this annotated bibliography. Generally, you will have more references here for an annotated bibliography for a particular topic. Okay, so a literature review. So the rest of this presentation is more focused on the literature review, where this is a written document, much like a manuscript. What you want to do in a literature review is, in general, rely on primary sources as the database. And you may rely on an annotated bibliography to build together your literature review. Does not present new primary scholarship. What you're doing, you're not presenting the results of an experiment here. What you're doing is you're presenting a lot of different studies that have presented information from experiments, and you're trying to pull that information together in a understandable message. What you typically do not include are other literature reviews in literature reviews, and that would be a secondary source. And what you're in essence writing is a secondary source. You are relying on information that has been generated from other researchers. So why do a literature review? Well, it's important to have a purpose for the literature review, and there is a purpose, and you can usually attack this from several different perspectives. One is the purpose of the literature review may be to describe the depth and breadth of literature on a particular topic, maybe to summarize key points, and maybe to identify opposing viewpoints of some topic. Maybe it's to evaluate the quality of research in a particular area, or maybe to clarify some key points from a body of literature. And ultimately, you want to integrate this information to an understandable message. But you do ultimately want to have a purpose for writing this literature review. And I'm going to go through that even as we talk about the thesis and dissertation. So just building on this a little bit, you may want to identify gaps in the literature. So the purpose of your literature review may be to summarize the breadth and depth of research on a particular topic, and to identify gaps in the literature. Maybe describe and summarize different hypotheses related to some topic. Maybe present opposing viewpoints, as I mentioned, and hopefully maybe through reviewing the literature, maybe even be able to resolve some conflicts between different studies. This is important also to do a literature review to avoid duplication of research. There's a lot of value in duplicating projects, no doubt. But what you also wanted to do is have literature reviews done to say, here's the depth and breadth of research in a particular area. What we now need is maybe some replication of studies, or maybe we need to identify more research in this area or do research in this area, and not have more research on a particular topic that has been thoroughly researched. You want to do a literature review often to avoid making similar research mistakes, or avoiding limitations of studies, or limitations and confounding factors that have been identified by other researchers. You want to increase the knowledge of a particular subject area. You want to provide a knowledge base for others to understand ultimately your research. And this is where I'm going to talk about the thesis and dissertation chapter of the literature review. That's really what you're trying to do, is establish a base understanding of the literature for the reader to be able to understand the other chapters in your thesis or dissertation, or why you're doing a particular experiment. And a literature review is also going to be really good to identify landmark studies, real key studies that are worth going into detail, because they are really landmarks. They provide really new knowledge for people to build on. A literature review can also be done to evaluate different methods or different methodology used to answer particular questions. This can be great when you start looking at the development of different instruments and validity and reliability of different instruments. So you can do a literature review on that specifically. Okay, so when you're doing a literature review or an annotated bibliography, you've got to identify where your resources are, and you're really going to be looking for primary sources. So you're going to be going to the library, you're going to be looking at journals. You can also rely on each other, your peers. And this is something that I like to do when working with groups, is share citations that you're finding for your projects, because you never know when that citation might actually help someone else. And so by sharing those different citations that you're finding, you can often help someone, or vice versa. You can see what other papers people are finding, and then sort of build on that. You can also rely on your faculty. Look at the work that your faculty have published. Look at their CVs, their curriculum vitas. Look at their Google Scholar pages. See what papers they published, and you can see what expertise the faculty have. You can also go and ask faculty about key papers that they know of on a particular topic, and then also going to conferences and looking at conference proceedings. But what's important about conference proceedings is that they often are not peer reviewed. However, they often represent the most current cutting edge research that is being done. And what I often do when I find a interesting research project presented at a conference, I'll look at the authors, and then I'll go look at the other work that they've done. And that can often help me identify other researchers who do work in that area. So conference proceedings can really be helpful, but ultimately when you write a literature review or even an annotated bibliography, you really want to minimize conference proceedings, because they are most likely not peer reviewed. So they haven't been fully vetted, and it may be too soon to really go through and relying on the information that's presented there. And often the information that you get from conferences or conference proceedings is really an abbreviated version of the work. Okay, so now literature review as part of a thesis or a dissertation. Dissertations can take different formats, but typically there will be a literature review chapter, or there can be. In a thesis, this can also take different formats, but a traditional thesis format is you have an introduction chapter, then you have a literature review chapter, then you have a methods chapter, results chapter, and discussion chapter. So the literature review as part of a thesis or a dissertation can be a specific chapter. That is written a little different, or can be written a little different than how you would write a manuscript, which I'll go through in just a bit. The whole idea of a literature review for a thesis is you are trying to provide the reader of your thesis sufficient information so that she can understand the critical literature related to the study. So here you can be really zeroed in on your interest of a particular topic, whereas a manuscript, we'll see, can be a little bit more broad in terms of how you write it, and you don't need in this chapter, you don't necessarily need some of the prose that you would include in a manuscript. But in this type of document for literature review, you'd identify critical papers, you review theories and different hypotheses that are being presented. You may go into methods related to your study, and that might be, literature review might be focused on the type of subject that's been recruited for a particular area. or instruments that have been used, or a certain experimental design, or how they process the data. These are things that can be in your thesis and dissertation literature review to help the reader understand why you've made decisions in your experiment. And you want to present sufficient detail, summarize key results, identify strengths and weaknesses of a particular work, and then really you're organizing primary sources in a particular logical format. All right, so that's just part of a thesis or a dissertation. So it's a little bit more, it doesn't necessarily have to be a standalone document. A literature review as a manuscript is a standalone document. This is something that you may come across when you're searching for literature, and we would call it a secondary source. And these are really important, but ultimately when you are citing work, you typically want to cite the primary sources. So literature reviews as manuscripts can be helpful to identifying primary sources. However, ultimately you want to go get those sources. They can also help you understand the information that a primary source may be presenting. And you may also see the context of how that information can be used to understand even a bigger picture of what that experiment was focused in on. Okay, so as a manuscript, you would have prose, written document, where you would formulate the problem, what question or hypotheses will be evaluated, what's the purpose of the literature review, as I mentioned. Then you would have a section on the methods of the literature review. What I mean here is not the methods of an experiment, but the methods you went to finding sources. So what keywords did you use? What search engines did you use? How many papers did you find in the beginning? Maybe it's thousands of papers. And then what criteria did you use to ultimately select a certain number of papers for it to include in your literature review? That would all be wrapped up into what we would call methods section for the literature review. So the data evaluation, how ultimately, how do you determine the most important results from a primary source? So this is all the methods that you are describing. Sometimes a literature review will include a flow chart of information. So for example, using these keywords and these search engines, I found 2,500 manuscripts. Then I applied a criteria. For example, the experiments all had to be from humans, and that limited the 2,500 down to 1,200 papers. And then at that point, I looked for papers that included at least female subjects, and maybe that drops it down to 50 papers. And then maybe I was looking for subjects that had a certain number of level of experience with a task, and that drops it down to maybe 15 papers, and so forth. And so you have this big number of papers you're starting with, and you're applying different criteria to ultimately get to maybe 10 papers that you're going to really zero in on for your literature review. Determine how each primary source contributes to the question asked. So that's part of the written document. The elements of a manuscript as for literature review, you have an introduction, the specific categories. So you do have sort of an outline that you work with, and then you can talk about specific areas within that outline. And it really does depend on the type of reason you're writing the literature review for, or the topic that you're covering and the breadth of work that's out there. And then ultimately you do want to have a conclusion where you're going to summarize information, or you can make a conclusion about some hypothesis or question that you asked on why you did the literature review. And in this case, you're going to be relying on published data to answer that question. Okay, so as you start writing the literature review, you would pull up a paper, and then you would discuss the contribution of that primary source to the problem that you are faced with, or the question that you are asking. And then you can talk about the relationships of different primary sources, but ultimately you're going to assimilate different data analyses or different data sets to provide a unique interpretation of the results. So now you're going to build from different sources and combine that information to an understandable message and hopefully generate new knowledge. Okay, so how do I develop a literature review? Well, if you're doing this as part of a thesis or dissertation, as you collect references, I would do an annotated bibliography, and then from there, develop an outline of information that you would present to the reader to understand the context of what you are going to do, the experiments that you're going to conduct. And you know, you want to just be reading. Most of you have heard my general advice for getting involved with research: read everything. Now here I'm focusing in on reading primary sources, but you may want to read textbooks, you may want to read secondary sources, but ultimately when you're doing an annotated bibliography or a literature review, you're really focusing in on primary sources. And then, you know, finally, always be looking for that interesting or important question that you want to know the answer to. If you have an interest in it, it's a lot easier to do this type of work because the information you're finding, it's sort of discovery. You're saying, oh, this is neat. I didn't know this. Now let me combine that information with some other information I received on the same topic. So it really becomes sort of a fun process where you're trying to discover information from a variety of primary sources and really look for where the information conflicts or where it builds on each other. Okay, I hope that's helpful. Enjoy your reading and enjoy your writing. Thank you.